Hello.
Hello. Hey, everyone. Welcome back to Here in Apologetics. Super pumped to join us today to have Dr. John Kronen all the way from the University of St. Thomas. We're talking about Hinduism and Christian philosophy. So, John, welcome. How you doing today?
Good. You're frozen again, but
Oh, I guess we'll just roll with it. If you can hear me, then with all the tech things we have to jump through, then that's good enough, and hopefully it's enough for our audience. So, yeah,
right.
How are you?
I'm all right. Yeah, it's a nice day here. Not too cold. It's not snowing. That's good. For November.
Yeah.
Minneapolis.
Yeah.
Shining.
Yeah, yes, Minnesota, you got all kinds of weather rolling that we may not get down here in Virginia. So, yeah.
We did have a little bit of snow already. But...
So, John, just to get us started, we're going to talk about Hinduism and Christian theology. I think a lot of times, especially with natural theology, people think they might be totally opposed. So they might be looking at maybe some misconceptions and whatnot. But before we get into that, John, do you want to talk a little bit about who you are and what you do?
Yes, I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. And it's a Catholic university. It's not as well known as Marquette or Georgetown and those, because it was a diocesan school. So it wasn't run by an order, right? A lot of them were run by Jesuits or Holy Cross Fathers. But it's actually the largest private school in Minnesota, and it's I think started in 1870. Campuses, and it still has a pretty strong, I think, liberal arts core, which is good about it, though they've kind of whittled it down recently. So all students used to have to take 2 philosophy and 3 theology. Now they take 1 philosophy, 1 theology, and then a third, just one or the other. So that's kind of the way the department is. There are quite a few people here who are interested in metaphysics and philosophy of religion. Younger people, especially, than I am. So there's one who's done something named Tim Paul on Christian mystery. So the Incarnation and the Trinity is published by Oxford. And then another one did something on apologetics. I also do philosophy, religion, metaphysics, and Baroque scholasticism, actually. So those are my areas, and I've published a number of articles in scholastic philosophy. I don't know if you talk about that or what it is, but Thomas Aquinas, Suarez, that sort of thing. And then certain things in the philosophy of religion, including a book that I co-authored with God's Final Victory, which is a defense of a kind of Christian universalism. All will be saved, but it's through Christ. So I'm interested in philosophical theology as well as natural theology. But for a long time, I've been interested in Indian philosophy. And it really strikes me that if you study Indian philosophy, they really have all the same problems and give similar solutions. It's always kind of analogous. There's a bit of Indian flavor to it, but they're really not doing something completely different. They came up with something called a pramana theory, which is a means or instrument of knowledge. And in that theory of logic that has some similarities with Aristotle's syllogism. And so then you do get arguments about all kinds of things, like whether or not we have immaterial immortal souls, right? Whether there's a self. And then there are a number of arguments based just on reason for the existence of God. And so I found that interesting. And a colleague of mine and I here published a paper in Faith and Philosophy called The Argument from Holes, Classical Hindu Design Argument. And that was the start of this. We're trying to show how this is a type of design argument, but it's strikingly different from any Western design arguments. It has some unique features that are interesting. And then that led us to think about kind of larger project comparing Indian natural theology with Western natural theology. And the Hindus are the ones that defend it, but will include, for example, Buddhists, because the Buddhists were sort of the great foes of theism and the ones that sort of attacks on the arguments and on just as a God. They also get arguments that there couldn't be a God. So that's sort of where I am now with doing this book. We've published a few papers that will gobble up.
Yeah.
Background.
Yeah, that's great, John. And I love what you're doing because you're trying to like look at like maybe like these two, some people think opposed worlds, like maybe like Indian natural theology and like a Christian or like a general like theistic natural theology, and try to say like, hey, maybe there's some bridges here that we don't really fully understand yet. So do you want to talk a little bit about like maybe like the aim of your project and like what's going on here with that?
Yeah, so part of it is just we want to strengthen natural theology, and it sort of had a low point early 20th century, and to some extent after Kant. I mean, a lot of people used to just say, oh well, Kant showed natural theology doesn't work, right? Or Kant and Hume, the double whammy. But then a number of people, as I'm sure you know, have kind of revived it, like Swinburne, big several volume work on natural theology, and William Rowe. I mean, even though he's an atheist, he helped because he really showed that certain criticisms of kind of classical cosmological arguments don't work. But we want to further that by looking at the Indian tradition. And one thing that especially struck my colleague as an important thing to note, that you can know when you look at Western is that people will tend to speak of things like the design argument or different versions of it. You'll see that too. And she's a very, her name's Sandra Menson. She's a very acute logician, and he just thinks that's wrong. There are sort of families of arguments, which might be called design or cosmological, but they're very different. And what might be a problem or a weakness in one might not be in another, right? So it's interesting to look at this full family of and looking at Hindu design arguments and present new arguments that are designed, but they're different in various ways, and they might not have some of the weaknesses of Western design arguments. And then in other cases, you could strengthen it by seeing that you might come up with a sort of exclusive disjunction. For example, if you think that if there are composite substances, you might think that they either are hylomorphic in some way or they're made of other substances, but you need a true whole there. And either way you go, you could give an argument for God, it seems to us. So we're going to have that as a chapter. Or in other cases, I think the others could find in both some similar arguments and insights. And I think when you find things in different cultures where they couldn't have influenced each other, right? Similar ideas, that sort of shows it's not culturally bound. I mean, the Chinese sort of discovered the Pythagorean theorem independently of the Greeks, so that's further evidence that it's based on something. So if you have certain Indian arguments that are similar to Western arguments in some way, that supports it. And then other cases, you might find Indians arguing for a key premise of a Western argument, like the principle of a kind of principle of causality that says everything that comes to be has a cause. Sort of weaker principle than a strong principle of sufficient reason. But many people, since Hume, think that just can't work. But there are some interesting Indian arguments for that I haven't really found in the West, so it can strengthen it that way. And then on the other hand, Western philosophers might have insights with respect to certain things the Indians used, but didn't reflect on, like especially a priori notions. they made use of them, but I don't think you have the same sort of reflection on that. This idea of a priori principles in Indian thought, and so you can come up with a way in which I suppose there's mutual support from these, and hopefully build up a kind of case for that strengthens natural theology.
Well, yeah, that's super cool, John, and I love that. I love the analogy you brought up, thinking about the Chinese. So saying hey, these other people discovered the Pythagorean theorem, and the Chinese did as well, independently. There's good reason to think that maybe that could push the idea that the Pythagorean theorem is actually useful and a true thing. And similarly, when we're looking at Indian natural theology, hey, if they're making these arguments that are very similar to these theistic arguments, maybe in the West independently, well, there's a really good reason to be a theist or push towards theism if these two groups of people independently are kind of coming to the same conclusion. So I love that. I think that's super helpful, kind of shaping the importance.
Not only are they not, descended from the Abrahamic traditions, but I think it's been pretty decisively shown that the Indians did not get their logic from Aristotle. They came up with it independently, and the classical, sometimes called the classical Indian syllogism, has similarities to Aristotle's. It's not totally different, but it's not quite the same either. So it's clear that it's independent of that and their whole philosophical theory, but they wrestle with many of the same problems and come up with similar solutions and somewhat similar arguments, but they're slightly different. They're not quite the same argument, which I think is an important thing to know.
Well, that's great. Thanks for that, John. So maybe let's sketch a brief history. When we're looking at classical Indian natural theology, what's the landscape in looking at the history of this ideas here?
Well, you have the roots of all of the Indic religions really go back to the religion of the Proto-Indo-Europeans or Proto-Indo-Iranians. So we can trace that back through the Rig Veda and certain texts of the Zoroastrians. The Zoroastrianism came from the same source. To, I don't know, sometimes 2,500 BC, they're really old, or 3,000 when they lived, they think, on the steppes of Russia near the Volga River. And that religion was focused on worshiping deities that are personifications of forces of nature, and also abstract properties, right, like victory or that sort of thing. So there are many gods, but even then there was somewhat of a tendency towards monotheism, either in sort of one high god, Varuna, being the head of the pantheon, or this notion of Rita, where which is a principle of sort of justice and order that the gods are sometimes spoken of, or they uphold it. So that's pointing in that direction. But for various reasons, this ancient polytheism started to kind of, fail. People didn't find it ultimately satisfactory. Right? So you really do get, in some of the later parts of the ancient text, the Rig Veda, monotheistic notions of one god who's often called by a new name, not one of the older gods, a kind of name from the function, sort of. So Prajapati is the all-father, and there the god is conceived after, this one god is conceived after the analogy with human parents, right? So there's something like a divine, it's not quite procreation, but something like that. And then Visvakarman, the all-maker, where God is conceived more as a craftsman. So at the end of this period, which is around, I mean, nobody knows for sure the date, but let's say 1000 BC, you're pushing towards monotheism. But then you also have the period of the Upanishads, which have certain monotheistic tendencies. Their texts, written later and in the subcontinent of India, and there's very much not happy with sort of polytheism, right? They're searching for the one cause of being of the universe and the inner nature of human beings. And in those texts, you find a kind of mixture of pantheism and panentheism. I'm sure you've heard that, right? It's a bit different.
Mm-hmm.
And then also monism. So you kind of have a sort of mixture of those things in the Upanishads. And you start to see certain, I guess, arguments for one God, but they're not reflecting on what they're doing. But the most famous one is from the Chandogya Upanishad, which is, I don't know, roughly 500 BC, 600 BC, where this father is talking to his son, and he says, "There are those who say that in the beginning there was only nothing, only without a second. But how can this be, my dear son? How can something come from nothing? No, in the beginning there was just being,
Mm-hmm.
one only without a second. And it thought, let me become many, I will procreate myself," which is sort of strange, right? And then the world is created in this way. So there you do have some kind of notion of everything coming from God. And that's one thing that Hindu theism differentiates from Abrahamic. They don't ever think of creation from nothing. They think that that's possible. Although in some schools you have something close, maybe an eternal creation, right? Things eternally are dependent on God, but he doesn't create in time. So anyway, you have that notion in there. But around the same time, there are all these overlapping things. These classical schools begin, and perhaps it was because of all these disagreements about the ultimate nature of reality. I think so started to reflect on question, well, how do we really know anything, right? What's the sources of or what's the evidence we have for our beliefs? You come up with this theory of, it's called the pramanas, which is means or instruments of knowledge, and kind of classical practices of the Nyaya Sutras, which was probably written around 200 AD, but reflects earlier thoughts because it's very aphoristic, it's very short, but
Mm-hmm.
it's meant to be memorized. And sutra means threads. It's kind of cool. So this language is related. It's an Indo-European language related to Latin, English, and all modern European languages except for some strange Hungarian. Nobody really knows where Hungarian came from, or Finnish or something. But that's related to our word sutures. Anyway, so these are very brief. These texts are written in this aphoristic way and very terse. So it's kind of hard to know what they mean without a commentary. But you find this well developed in the Nyaya Sutras theory of pramanas, means or instruments of knowledge, how we know. And they tied that epistemology are natural cognitive faculties, right? So they sort of thought, well, let's look at things we know and then how we know by using our cognitive faculties. So the most basic one was perception. Of course, they just mean sense perception, external perception and internal perception. It's a bit more like what we'd say is introspection, by which you come to be aware of your own inner mental states, right? Like if you're feeling a pain now or you're thinking something or whatever. And then inference. And they thought of that as being based on what they called the Vyapti relation. It's sort of like in Aristotle, the major term of a syllogism. You note things always go together. Like wherever there's fire, smoke, there's fire, and wherever there's not fire, there's smoke. So then you can set up this relation, which they ultimately come to think is rooted in universals. This school, something like Platonic universals.
Mm-hmm.
And they start to formalize this. There's this formal Indian syllogism, which with the thing you want to prove. So the canonical example is you start with there's fire on yonder hill because there is smoke. So that briefly states there's this property that points to another property, right? And wherever there's smoke, there's fire, as in a kitchen, not on a lake. Then you put them all together. That hill is characterized by smoke, which is known to be invariably concomitant with fire. So that hill has fire. And then they'll start using this in philosophical ways, right? So you see that early proof in this Nyaya school, which means school of logic for God, is something like the Earth was made by an intelligent agent because it's a whole, it's a composite whole. Whatever's a whole was made by an intelligent agent, like a cloth or something. But the Earth's like that. So there's some intelligent agent, and then you get that this agent has to be unembodied and have eternal knowledge, right? So it becomes very godlike, this agent. But anyway, so all the schools start to adopt this logic, and they use this logic to argue with each other. All of, including the Buddhists, the non-Hindus. The only school that won't recognize inference is called the Carvaka, and they were kind of like ancient Greek atomists. They were totally atheists and against any kind of religion. They're kind of like contemporary angry atheists. Religion's bad. It's the opiate of the masses, and this is all superstitious nonsense. And they didn't like inference, I think, and they attacked inference because, of course, it might be a way to get at God or an immaterial soul, afterlife, etc. And then the third one that all the Hindu schools recognize was Shabda, or word, and that's like testimony. And they argued that we know many things by testimony. Came up with a kind of theory of what makes knowledge based on the words of others, right? Or cognitions based on the words of others, a piece of knowledge, that it's reliable or something. And that's important for them because of the Hindu scriptures, right? There's the way in which we know about transcendental realities and our certain of our moral duties, our religious duties, like sacrifices, duties having to do with different paths or stages of life. And one thing that's interesting there is the kind of oldest, most orthodox school ended up arguing that the Vedas are eternal. They're authorless texts. I mean, this is like a biblicism to an extent I've never seen anywhere. They sound through the universe, and the rishis heard them at the beginning, not because God did it or whatever. They just had the merit to hear them and wrote them down. And theistic schools argued against that and said, no. So here's another kind of argument for God. Every text must have an author. So this text has an author, but the only one that could have authored this would be an omniscient being. So kind of, an argument for God from that. So anyway, there are a lot of these different schools sort of that come about seemingly at the same time, and they argue with each other. But the Nyaya Vaisheshikas were the early theistic schools that really argued for God's existence. So they also thought it's based on scripture. And then later on, you have theistic schools of the Vedanta, which is focused on the Upanishads. Vedanta means end of the Vedas. And these schools, like Ramanuja, interpreted the Vedas as teaching monotheism. The most famous school in the West is Advaita Vedanta. There are reasons for that, even though it was an important school, but it wasn't ever the most important. And that's Shankara. I don't know if you've ever heard of the philosopher, theologian Shankara, or Advaita Vedanta, or just Vedanta, sometimes they mean it. But he interpreted the Upanishads ultimately in a non-theistic way. It's kind of hard. He says there's a God at the phenomenal level, but the ultimate level, there's just this one Brahman, which is being consciousness bliss. It's the same as the Atman, the inner soul. So from the ultimate point of view, there is no diversity, there is no change, there is no God. You just realize the inner nature of yourself as being the same as Brahman. But the theistic schools really went after Shankara on that, both from the text, and then they also argued that this doesn't make any sense. But it's interesting, you find that some of these theistic schools, and I'm sorry to be using all these words, I probably need a little chart of them. I know it's sort of hard, but like of Ramanuja, he really just doesn't like natural theology because he thinks you should rely on scripture alone. right? Somehow that's the only way you can know the transcendent God by his own revelation. And God is so transcendent, you can't know it through reason. And it sort of reminds me a bit of attacks on natural theology by certain Christians, right? Like Karl Barth did not like natural theology, and he thought it ended up putting human beings in the driver's seat, right? And that it meant you weren't relying on God's revelation. He used to say that what is first in the ontic order holds its own in the epistemic order, right? So God can only be known through God. So that's another thing that interesting kind of, I think, criticism of natural theology that we'll probably look at in our book. It's sort of revelation or religiously based arguments from theists that find this almost kind of, impious, and it derogates from the supreme in religious matters authority of the Vedas, or the Shruti, they say, the heard text, because they also say that the rishis at the beginning of creation heard it, but it's not that it's sounding through the universe, it's that God revealed it. So you have very much a notion of God as the author of these texts, which of course you also find in Abrahamic faiths, especially Islam. So that's a little bit of it. And then running throughout that, there were schools like the Buddhists, as I said, attacked their belief in one God and the self, just a self, substantival self, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's this no self theory. The self is what we call a self, is a sort of series of causally related mental states, and the purpose is for Buddhism is to no longer believe in a permanent self, because that keeps you attached to things to achieve nirvana. But anyway, they were very much opposed to belief in God, and for the great kind of Indian atheists, they gave arguments for the conclusion that God doesn't and can't exist, and then they attacked the Nyaya school. They're this realist school who are the main kind of proponents of natural theology. And the Buddhists and the Nyaya kind of argued with each other for about 800 years. And the way that about everything, and the way the arguments would kind of go is, the Nyaya would say, well, there's a God, and the Buddhists would, no, there isn't a God. The Nyaya would for universals, something like Platonic universals. There's smokeness and fireness and soulness, distinct from particular. The Buddhists are like, no, there isn't. They're just particulars, And the Nyaya say, well, there's a substantial self. And the Buddha, no, there isn't. So that's a really interesting debate, and they kind of very acutely engaged with each other, and they did so in a way that's fascinating because it goes over centuries with different thinkers, right? So this one thinker, Vatsyayana, will put forward the kind of Nyaya case, and then he's attacked by Dinaga, the Buddha, who died of car accident. And goes on and on. Really until about the year 1000. Convinced Nyaya people think that's because they were just ultimately defeated in debate. And it's probably really more just because of the conquest of the Mughals. Destroyed the Buddhist seminaries, I guess you could say, or what's the word? Seminary, monasteries, which were centers of learning. So it's a strange thing, right? Buddhism, died out in the homeland of its birth. There's hardly any Buddhists left in India. But of course, there are many in China, Japan, California, right? But anyway, that's the sort of, it's complicated, but there are all these different schools and attitudes towards natural development, but also some schools that were theists, right, want to say there's something wrong with natural theology. And you find, as I said, you find that attitude in Barth, and there's a little bit of that in Luther too. I mean, he says there's a natural theology, but he doesn't want to emphasize it, right? You should look only to Christ, to Scripture. You're engaged in reason to try to know something about God, you'll fall into a kind of theology of glory. You won't get it right? You have to follow the Scriptures.
Okay. Well, that's super great, John. And I love how you kind of look at like the different parts of natural theology in like the Indian world, looking at how they kind of like resonate with like the Western world. So I think that's super helpful for people seeing this. So like maybe let's just like, if there's maybe like one example that you'd say like, hey, going back to like the idea of like the Chinese like the Pythagorean theorem, lining up with like Western like thought about math and stuff. Like, do you have like one example that's like your favorite to go to? I know you just went through a lot. But, like, what's one you'd love for listeners to kind of take away with and say, oh wow, like the Indians really thought about this and came to something very similar as like people in the West.
So one thing that's interesting and that is striking is from this work by a 10th century philosopher, Udayana, and he wrote commentaries on the Theism Sutra, but also a number of independent works. One called the Atma Tattva Viveka, which defends the soul or the self against the Buddhists. But then another work that I think has a beautiful title. It's called the Nyaya Kusala Manjale. So that means flower offering of logic. And the Indians would worship God using flour, right, for the night. So sometimes they thought, kind of like Christians think that, right, became incarnate. God will become incarnate in the idol, our devotion. But anyway, they would put flowers at his feet, and so Udayana is saying the philosopher can worship God using arguments for his existence, right? And each chapter is called a cluster of arguments, and in that ends by saying that the wise believe that the worship of God is the way to heaven. And he says there are 5 species opposed to ours, and one is the Karavaka, right? So they just deny that there is any means at all to another world, not just the worship of God, because the human being is a physical organism made up of atoms. There is no soul. Consciousness comes about kind of as a epiphenomenon or a I want to say what's the word, supervenient property, right? And I'll say it's sort of like when you mix certain things together, you get alcohol, liquor out of it. When you're dead, so on and so forth. And they even thought that the world came to be, they assert, accidentally. And so it gets even deeper, right? They seem to want to deny causality altogether. So Udayana says, well, say that the world came to be accidentally, you could mean one of these 5 things. Either there's no cause of it at all, or there are causal antecedents. They it's sort of like Humean antecedents. They don't produce anything. They're not responsible. Or the world came to be from nothing, as in non-existent entities, right? Nothing. Or this is the most interesting one. Or the world came to be by its own nature. So that means, you think of sort of Leibniz saying God has a reason for his existence, right? In his essence, even though he wasn't caused, the Karavaka want to say finite things come to be, right, or contingent things by their own nature at a certain time. Nothing outside of their nature causes it. But anyway, Eudianus says a number of interesting things about these, but one thing that I think is striking, and I haven't found in the West, is his defense that whatever comes to be must have causes and must have be some efficient cause, is that he says, well, look, you have to admit that a necessary condition for something's coming to be is that it be absolutely possible. Three things coming to be. But then he says either that's sufficient or not. So if it's sufficient, everything that could exist should have, then everything would be eternal, and we wouldn't be any non-eternal things, right? But we do. So you must suppose that there's something other than just the bare possibility, right? Absolute possibility of the thing, which produces it. And this is in the form of causes. So there must be a material cause. The Caravaca admit that, but he says there has to be a efficient cause as well. I mean, the shirt, the cloth, can't come to be without the thread, but you also need, right, a weaver of it. And so that's interesting. And then the more subtle one is this notion, right, that they seem to have, which is by its nature, or things in the world. And here's what the Caravaca tried to make that intelligible. They said, well, pot in pot shards. It's sort of weird. This has to do with the way the Hindus made pots. They'd make the kind of different parts first. Claws would be bread. Now, why is that ultimately? Why do pots come to be in pot shards? Well, it's just its nature. Ultimately, you subsist the nature of pots and pot shards or cloths and thread. And so then they say, you defenders of causality, have to admit that it's just the nature of a pot to come to be there. So why couldn't it just be the nature of the pot, not just to come to be, that's sort of its locus, but the time it comes to be, it's just by its own nature, right? It will come to be. And Eudianus has a number of subtle things. I can't get into all of it, but he really thinks that won't do because, again, if it could come to be without a cause, it could be sort of eternal, right? That's the way he puts it, or not contingent, right? But then it would give up its nature as a contingent if it could just come to be of itself. It would always exist, and then it would be an eternal or necessary thing. And so that won't work. So that's just a highlight of. I mean, it's much more intricate, the dialectic. But I find that is a interesting defense in the principle of causality.
That's great. I love that, John. So here's an interesting question I'd love to kind of close out with, we have a little more time, is like, do Hindus like worship a theistic God like the Christians, the Muslims, and the Jews? Like, what do you think about that?
I would say yes, and the best way to probably defend that is to look at or thinking that they don't, and sort of clearing the way there, and then do. So why might one think that they don't? Well, because for one thing, some might say you need to have it. I mean, some Christians and so on would say it needs to be right from the Abrahamic tradition. We need to have that descend, our religion or belief in God descend from Father Abraham. So there needs to be a tie there in terms of the relation. And obviously this doesn't descend from Abraham. I don't think that could work. That doesn't seem right, because it seems like then the Christian would have to be suspicious of the conversion of the Gentile, right? I mean, St. Paul talks about how the Gentiles knew in their hearts that there was a God, and he talks about the church fathers look to, Greek thinkers like Plato and so on as knowing through natural reason somehow something of God. So it seems to me to say that you need to tie it in that way. It goes against St. Paul himself and a number of places in Rome. Right? And so even people like Luther and Calvin will admit there's this natural religion. And the Gentiles were able to be converted by certain of the fathers appealing to, right, kind of natural theology, natural arguments for God's existence you find in Plato and Aristotle, and Cicero. And so I hope you see what I'm saying. If you necessarily tie it to the Abrahamic, it's got to be part of the Abrahamic tradition, then I think the conversion of the Gentiles was based on Greek philosophy. Would come and that's something that Pannenberg, I don't know if you've heard of Wolfhart Pannenberg? At that point.
A tiny bit.
A tiny bit, yeah. He really pushes this point home when he's trying to defend the importance of natural theology. And then there's another argument, though, that might be, okay, let that go. It's still that you need to suppose that you have basically the same definition and not just the attributes, and they do have the same attributes, right? God is omniscient, omnipotent, uncreated, good. But you need to understand them in the same way. Let me back up a little bit. They would understand omnipotent the way Aquinas did, in the sense of able to bring about any possible state of affairs. But they would just think that certain states of affairs we think are possible to be brought about. They would say not, like something coming absolutely from nothing. But you might say, well, that's not good enough. You've got to suppose that he could bring it about from nothing. But then that would mean, for example, that I think, certain Christians would have to say other Christians don't worship the same God, because if you look at a number of thinkers in the Christian tradition, they think God can bring about the salvation of all through efficacious grace. And it wouldn't be a violation of their nature, right? He could do that. And it says all sin to some extent is involuntary and against your nature. So God could just sort of illuminate you with grace, and it would get rid of these tendencies towards sin. And it isn't quite like a normal compatibilism, because it's in accordance with your nature, right? There wouldn't be any violence there, and he could do that. But then others say, no, there would be a violence, right? That people that really push free will defenses, the problem of evil, or why God couldn't save all. I want to say somehow it'd be violating creaturely autonomy, or it's metaphysically impossible for him to do it. And I don't think I'm not comfortable with saying that, Christians who don't think God could do this aren't worshiping the same God, because, he can't do things that I would say that he could do. I do think that he can do that. It's really in line, not just Aquinas, but Suarez. It's in line with the older Lutheran theologians. It's really an old view that, of course, God could do this. He could sort of convert us all by kind of flooding us with grace, and that wouldn't be a violence. It's metaphysically possible. It's not contrary to our autonomy or anything like that. So my point there is, if you think you've got to have exactly the same notion of omnipotence, or you're not worshiping the same God, it's got to be this really big omnipotence. Then I would be someone who would say, Christians who believe that God can't do this aren't worshiping the same God, because they think God can't do certain things that I think God can do, and that seems to me unacceptable consequence. So let me give the positive case. Well, one thing is just there's a referent, right? You might say you have the same God just because of the notion of the creator and sustainer of the universe, right? So you have texts that say Brahman, one of the words for the divine, right? It's that from which this universe came as the ultimate thought. And this is a bit like Kripke. So, Kripke thinks names are sort of rigid designators. So he's got this famous thing where we pick out cats by, pointing to paradigm examples. That's a cat. Anything like that's a cat. And if we found out cats are actually not living organisms, but robots, cleverly disguised robots that seem to be living organisms, he says, because of that, because you've got this reference, right? That would mean not that they're not cats, but that we mistakenly thought cats were living organisms, right? But in fact, they're cleverly designed robots. So you might say, with God, you've at least got this reference. And I think Aquinas thinks that somewhat, because if you look at the 5 ways, each of them ends with all called us God. And it seems to be some sort of notion of this is the first cause, right? This is the necessary being, etc. I don't think that'll quite do it, though, because of this. It seems like it's not just reference, but some sort of sense of sense. And so you have to look back to the religious impulse. And I really think that the best way to start with a kind of definition or description of God is a person worthy of worship.
Okay.
Worship. And the Hindu that as well. And so maybe this is where you get some notion of right, the most perfect being, St. Anselm, a being than which none greater can be conceived. I think goodness is part of that, but you do find the same thing among Jews, right? They say he's filled with auspicious qualities, repellent of all evil, right? And he says every good-making property God has infinitely. This is what makes him worthy of worship. And also, he's our loving creator. So the Nyaya will often say, and this is striking too, I think, if you Christianity, he is like our Father who always wishes us good. What an amazing, beautiful thing to say. So that's my case, that it's the same, because it's the best possible being, the being worthy of worship. And then out of that, they do get, omniscient, omnipotent, so on and so forth. And what's interesting is omnipotent is understood as being able to do anything that's absolutely possible. It's just that they think it's like metaphysically possible, right? It's just that they think it's not metaphysically possible for something to come to be from nothing. So they've either got pre-existent matter, or in other cases, somehow creatures exist as sort of attributes utterly dependent on God, but distinct from him. They're not the same as him. And then he sort of gives them power and a certain independence. And you might think of that as sort of their way of thinking about the divine ideas. There's something like that there, that since he's infinite, he includes these as aspects. But anyway, that's where the sort of, it's not, see what I mean? It's not a formal disagreement. It's just a disagreement about whether this is possible.
Yeah.
And it is interesting in the other respects. They seem to be very like the high theologians, very like Western theologians, because with respect to his omniscience, they say it's outside of time, right? One sweep, God sees all that has happened, is happening, will happen, but it's not determined. He doesn't determine it, except for some of them, because he sort of surveys this all in it, eternal now, right? So if I'm doing something tomorrow at 4, God knows it, but not that doesn't determine it. He knows it because he sees me doing it, that sort of thing. He doesn't cause me to do it.
Mm-hmm.
With respect to omniscience, they're very similar, and God is also, perfectly good. God, Diana says there were different views about why God creates, but a number of them think he creates for our benefit. There couldn't be anything that he could benefit by creating. It's just for our good, which is the same thing Aquinas. So that seems pretty high to me. And then I guess I've got another argument. If I got to heaven and found out that the perfectly good creator and sustainer of the universe who loves me and always wills my good and is able to defeat evil and so on, just didn't create out of nothing because it's impossible, I think I would say, not, oh, I guess you're not God. I guess just that's impossible, right? That's my intuition on that. People might have different intuitions, but I don't know. What do you think of that?
I think it's interesting. I like thinking about the idea of, where am I trying to put this? Thinking about the idea of like God being perfect. Seems to be a little bit different than where you're going, but thinking if like God is perfect, like he wouldn't be trying to deceive anyone. So thinking about the Hindus, like it seems like God wouldn't want to like deceive them. So like he wouldn't want them to like come to false conclusions about God, which gets into the question of religious pluralism. So it's interesting to wrestle. It's hard because I don't know like Indian like philosophy and theology enough to really like come to conclusions about like what they really like fully believe, because like that's not my sphere at all. But that's generally what I think. Sorry if it's a little vague, but I like one of the reasons I want to do this is because like this is something that I haven't like thought about at all. So yeah, that's great.
Well, it doesn't seem to me he's coming to false conclusions. I mean, so the disagreement would be about just the certain attributes. If we're talking about the same thing rather than different things, and it's hard for a monotheist to really say, any monotheist, we're talking about different gods. It would seem to be more like properties. So it's sort of like if someone thinks, I don't know, Obama had 2 sons rather than 2 daughters or something. It doesn't seem like thinking that Obama had 2 sons would entail that you're not talking about Obama. I mean, you're just mistaken about property of Obama. And even at the formal level, right, God's omniscient. It's just that they think certain things are absolutely impossible. It's the same view of omniscience that Aquinas has, right? He says,
Yeah.
he doesn't say, I don't want to say God can't do these things. This is what he says. I'd rather just say they can't be done. So, if they agree with us on that, and that God is perfectly good and loves us, sustains us, he's filled with auspicious qualities, repellent of all evil, seems like it's the same God, but we're just disagreeing about what things can absolutely possible to be done and things can't, right? These relate to what is sometimes following Kant called a priori synthetic truths, right? So there are certain necessary truths, but denying them doesn't land you in a contradiction. I mean, one is just everything that comes to be has a cause. So there's that. And then also I would just think it would be certain properties. Like it seems to me, and I don't know what you think, but it seems to me that Muslims are worshiping the same God, but Christians think he's triune, right? Whereas, no, that seems a better, or sorry, whereas they don't. That seems a better way of thinking about it, especially because you got this reference point, right? The creator and sustainer of the universe. So that's part of my argument. And then this notion of most perfect possible being, right? And it's filled in much the same way, perfectly good, all-knowing, right? Having I guess what I want to say is this, how do you pick it out? It seems like the tradition in the West and in India is kind of the same, that God has formally, not just metaphorically, right, or analogously, every pure perfection possible, so that any good making property that doesn't intrinsically involve imperfection, like maybe having eyes or ears is better for us, but in and of itself it shows an imperfection. But wisdom's not that, right? Being wise or just. Maybe having the virtue of courage shows an imperfection. Good,
yeah.
But it shows a sort of, but they arrive at sort of the same list, filled with auspicious qualities, all-knowing, sovereign, beautiful, etc. So that's part of it, and then it's hard to see how they're not talking about the same thing. I mean, if you've got many gods, because not one of them is perfect. It seems like they're not really divine, right? They're just sort of superhuman. Well, yeah, you could say the people that worship Zeus are worshiping a different god than Paul or whatever. But if you got this one god creator, you have the same notion of sort of how to arrive at attributes, where you think of the ones that don't intrinsically involve an imperfection, ones that do. You get rid of the ones that involve imperfection or limitation. Contribute to this being the attributes that are free of any intrinsic limitation. To the nth degree, it's hard for me to see how you could be talking about
yeah.
being.
Well,
that makes sense to you? Or?
Yeah, I think I'm tracking with you, John. So we're kind of towards the end of our time here. So where do you kind of want to leave this? I feel like we made some good progress here talking about like Indian natural theology and Western natural theology, and how there's like a lot of things like it seems like they kind of came up with similar ideas independently, and how it can kind of motivate like an idea of like thinking like maybe like theism is true. So like where do you want to wrap this up, John?
I guess, something that I'm really am struggling with is the problems with religious pluralism. And I think you really want to steer clear of sort of two extremes, but it's hard to know where to go in between, right? So one is the pluralism of Hick. I don't know if you've heard about that. So he wants to say all religions are worshiping the same thing. He calls it the real, capital R. And he uses Kantian notions and also Shankara's idea. So it turns out all of them are talking about it, but the ones that really think that it's personal and so on are kind of falling into an error. And so they can't, what they're saying is true of God can't be literally true. And I mean, I think it's sort of incoherent, his way of doing it. I see why he does it, because it seems like he's ultimately kind of defending a certain view of the ultimate, which not everyone agrees with, right? The ultimate reality, and that's a non-theistic one. On the other hand, saying somehow we have the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and the rest of them are all wrong. Well, that's incoherent too, and doesn't seem to me to be the sort of thing a good God would do. I mean, St. Paul says at various and sundry times he spake to our forefathers, right? Seems like a good God would be working there, and we have it in our hearts, St. Paul says, and would be revealing things. And then when to say that they're totally wrong, you'd be contradicting yourself, because they're totally wrong. You mean in believing there's a God who's perfectly good and all loving? No, you can't mean that. So what is it to work out right in between? And you can't ignore just these, that there are differences. So maybe there's a way, though, that you could work out something where each of the great religions reveals some aspect of the divine that is either not found in any others, or if it's found, it's not emphasized to the same degree, right? And maybe even if you end up thinking, let's say Ramanuja's view that somehow we always existed as sort of modes of God, or parts of his body. We're not the same as him. We're sort of sustained in his being. Doesn't work. Still, that goes along with some notion that we're connected to God, and maybe some notion that, as some theologians said, that uh, uh, the perfections of all things are kind of pre-contained in God. Right? So there's a rootedness of God. It's just a creation from nothing. I mean, how does that relate to divine essence? It seems like there should be something there. I mean,
Yeah.
the scholastics would talk about God eminently contains all these perfections, or even Descartes would. I don't know. So I haven't got this worked out, but I think it is challenging, and I don't want to just say it's all the same and ignore these differences because they're important and
Yeah.
work, or say we got it all right and you're all wrong. Especially because it seems hard to say that when they agree with us on a number of things. And how could it be sort of accidental? I mean, we're all creatures of God. We do live in the same world. St. Paul says somehow traces of him are found in this, right?
Yeah.
This world by reflecting on. And it seems like we do want to at least say,
Yeah.
Agree with.
That's great, John. And I love how you kind of left this on a mystery. So for people to kind of think about as they listen to this. But yeah, that's going to be it for today. So John, I'm so grateful for your time. And I love how your work and your research, because you're kind of like bringing up things that a lot of people probably haven't thought about. Like people are going to probably look at this and be like, what? Like I thought Hinduism and Christianity or like Islam are totally opposed. And I love your work, John, because that's kind of what you're doing, is trying to shed light on like this mystery. So that's it for today. This is your Apologetics. And John, thank you so much for your time. Super, super grateful for everything you do and for your time here today. And I'm glad we finally got all the tech stuff figured out. So yeah.
Sorry about that.
It's all good. Thank you everyone for having tuning in today. God bless, and we'll catch you next time.